Last week, Jennifer and I returned from Israel, our first trip there for each of us. And needless to say, it was an inspiration to see some of the holiest spots in the world, including the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus performed some of his most dramatic and profound miracles, including walking on the water and calming the storm and feeding the multitudes and others. The Church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the site of Jesus' crucifixion, an empty tomb, the Church of the Nativity, and in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, towns where Jesus spent a lot of time, in Nazareth and Capernaum, the Upper Room, the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, and the list goes on. During the week we were there, we visited a place called Masada, an ancient Roman fortification in the southern district of Israel, overlooking the Dead Sea, a place where King Herod built 2 palaces for himself. In the Jewish rebellion against Rome, circa 65 AD, and during and after the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the revolutionary group called the Sicarii seized the Roman fortress, Masada, and held it until the Romans built a siege ramp and were able to reach the top of the fortress, only to find that the rebels had killed themselves in order to not be taken into slavery by Rome. The leader of the Jewish insurrectionists said to his people that they were the very first to revolt against the Romans and the very last to fight against them. The siege of Masada is often viewed in today's Israel as a symbol of Jewish heroism. Masada became a symbol for a heroic last stand of Israel 2,000 years ago and played a major role for Israel in forging its national identity today. It symbolized the strength they showed when they were able to keep hold of Masada for almost 3 years. And to many Israeli soldiers, and we saw quite a few of them when we were there today, Masada represents the sacrifices soldiers made in honor of their state and is still a site of military ceremonies. This weekend in our own country, we remember those, of course, who made the ultimate sacrifice in order that we may enjoy the freedoms that we still cherish today. The legacy of sacrifice rings through every generation and reminds us that we must never forget, as Lincoln said, from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And those who gave the last full measure of devotion more than encapsulated Paul's words in Philippians, read by Jordan this morning: with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own interests, but also for the interest of others. And Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, read by Billy this morning: greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. When many men and women answer the call to serve their country, it's not about themselves. It's about a cause much greater than themselves. The military cemeteries across the nation and the world, as you saw in the American cemetery in Normandy this morning during the film clip, are evidence of putting aside one's own wants and ambitions to the greater understanding that God didn't place us here on earth to worry about our own egos and desires, but to worry about the future of our children and our children's children, so that they too may continue to live in a land of liberty. Those who made the ultimate sacrifice understood this and will be immortalized in the hearts and minds of Americans. All of this begins with the attitude that God didn't place you and me on earth to absorb only what is good for you and me, but to absorb what is good for humanity, to To this end I must strive. To this end I must serve. David Brooks writes about President Lincoln's encounter with General George McClellan and the president's attempt to persuade the general to be more aggressive in his command of the Union troops during the Civil War. When Lincoln arrived at General McClellan's home, the general was not at home. So Lincoln told the butler that he and the Secretary of State, William Seward, and an aide to the Secretary, John Hay, would wait in the parlor. When General McClellan finally arrived, instead of talking to Lincoln, he decided to retire for the evening. The aide, John Hay, was livid. How could anyone show so much disrespect for a president of the United States? Lincoln, though, according to Brooks, was unruffled and said, better at this time not to be making points of etiquette and personal dignity. I'd be happy to hold the reins of the general's horse if it was good for the Union. See, this wasn't about him. It was about a greater cause of preserving the Union. And so it is when we recall any legacy of sacrifice. It normally results in a better future for the ones who were beneficiaries of that same sacrifice. In this case, the sacrifice was Lincoln's personal ego. There are many other examples. All the sacrifices our parents made for us help make us better and more thoughtful citizens. The hours and days that our teachers have sacrificed for us and help enable what we are doing today. All the inspiration and mentoring that coaches have done for thousands of student athletes have greatly improved not only the quality of their lives, but the qualities of their future. All the sacrifice of time of the scientists, of the electronic geniuses, of the innovators that resulted in incredible scientific breakthroughs have greatly contributed to the enormous conveniences of our time. When we think of our lives, consider the legions of the legacies of sacrifices that have paved the way for our futures. Many of them are subtle. Many of them are dramatic. No matter which one, they fit again what Paul said in Philippians. Do not merely look out for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. You know, much of the quality of our lives has depended on the sacrifices of those who have gone before us and have thought less about the success of themselves and more about the success of others. It's a biblical concept. What better example than what Jesus sacrificed on his way to the cross? In the old city of Jerusalem, there's a winding processional route referred to as Via Dolorosa, Latin for sorrowful way, believed to be the path that Jesus actually took to the cross, and to what they refer to as the stations of the cross along the way. But particularly powerful, though, is what Jesus likely endured along the way to Calvary, all in the name of his sacrifice for you and me, beginning with his friends' betrayals and denials, being whipped by the Romans, his condemnation to death, his actual carrying of the cross, his nailing to the cross, and finally his death on the cross. But it's quite simple. Jesus' legacy of sacrifice changed the world. The cross radically altered how we were to view each other. No longer with mistrust, but with trust. No longer with suspicion, but with acceptance. No longer with enmity and envy, but with compassion and comfort. And in human terms, the concept of sacrifice is magnified in what we remember this weekend. The ultimate sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Americans whose memories of patriotism and courage are interred in cemeteries and other resting places in the towns and the mountains, in the hills, in the valleys, across America and beyond. The New York Times wrote just a few days ago, there is a spring-like, affirming mood to this day. There are grand public memorials, as there should be, but in some ways, the most meaningful are the intimate ones, the private ones, where we both mourn and celebrate the men and women who have died in their country's service. What transforms this nation's cemeteries today isn't merely fresh flowers or small American flags or carefully tended gravestones. It's the presence of quiet people paying homage to a life that was sacrificed. Sacrifices that have preserved the beauty of liberty. As Justice Anthony Kennedy put in a famous Supreme Court decision, as reported by David Brooks, at the heart of liberty, he said, is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. I mentioned a long time ago, I've taken the occasion over the years to stop at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., a war that my generation particularly relates to. There I have stood in memory of the over 50,000 Americans killed in that Southeast Asian war. One of the persons on that wall was a young man named George Treats, who was killed in combat not too long after he graduated from high school in 1965. George was a member of the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Field Artillery Regiment. He graduated from Newcastle High School, was a talented basketball player with a dominating presence underneath in the steel mill town just north of Pittsburgh, PA. He was a friend of my older brothers. I don't know for sure, but I imagine that George wasn't quite talented enough to earn a college athletic scholarship. His family was from a side of town that was generally poor, so I imagine there were very little resources to support George if he wanted to go to college. Instead, George enlisted in the Army after high school. He answered the call. He served his country. He fought nobly to help preserve freedom. He died on the ground in Vietnam. His name, though, is forever carved on the granite memorial right just northeast of the Lincoln Memorial. He will be remembered as a young man who bravely served his nation and who died for his country at the age of 20. But what we don't think about too much when we recall a young man as George, representing the million men and women in our country who have died since the Continental Army was first formed in the late 18th century, is that George and many others didn't have the chance to return home. Never had the chance to get that first job. Never had the chance to go to a high school reunion. Never had the chance to just hang out with his friends again. Never had the chance to maintain his friendships with the guys on his basketball team. Never had the chance to see his parents and siblings again. Never had the chance to marry. Never had the chance to raise a family. Never had the chance to perhaps see the baptism of his child or walk his daughter down the aisle. Never had the chance to enjoy the rest of his life. What does all this say to us this morning? It's simply a reminder of the depth and the magnitude of sacrifice that so many have made for you and me. And the only way that we can repay it is to honor it, to be eternally grateful, to be good stewards of liberty, and to show our gratitude today to those who are serving in the armed forces. As former President George H.W. Bush said, each of the patriots whom we remember today was first a beloved son or daughter, a brother or sister, or a spouse, a friend, a neighbor. Amen.